It's a common sense recap of the big stories. It's Katz and Cosby on 77 WABC.
We are back here on Katz and Cosby. Well, our next guest was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, an incredible neurosurgeon. He's also head of American Cornerstone Institute. And joining us now is the great Dr. Ben Carson here on Katz and Cosby. Dr. Carson, this is Rita. It's so great to have you back on the show.
Thanks, man.
I know you really want to get out the message of getting out to vote. This is incredible. 59 million people so far, Dr. Carson, early voting. Tell us your thoughts of where the race is now.
Well, I think people are listening and they're recognizing the importance of voting. You know, you hear so many people say, there are millions of other people voting. My one vote doesn't really count. But you were just recently talking about the student in Ann Arbor, Michigan, who voted illegally, the student from China. Well, guess what? Your one vote cancels out that one illegal vote. And we don't know how many other illegal votes. So that one vote actually counts a lot, and people need to think about that. But I think a lot of, particularly evangelicals, are listening, because in 2020, 20 million evangelicals didn't vote. And so many of them say things like, I don't want to be in a position of choosing between the lesser of two evils. But when you stop and think about it, unless Jesus Christ is on the ballot, you're always voting between the lesser of two evils. So that's why you have a brain, so you can sit there and figure out what works for you, what works for your children. And we have to remember, you know, in terms of our freedoms, you know, a couple of hundred years ago, it was brave Americans fighting with muskets to maintain our freedom. In World War II, it was brave Americans fighting with rifles, grenades, and bombs. And now it's us fighting with the ballot. And that's what will preserve our freedoms.
You know, Dr. Ben Carson, too, we've been talking a lot on this show about what's been happening with the migrants and this wide open border. And nothing I've heard from Kamala Harris has given me any comfort as an American that this is going to stop. What do you say to people out there who, you know, at the end of the day, who is going to keep you safe?
Well, we've already seen, we can put the two together, the Trump administration and the Biden-Harris administration. Who had the better record when it came to preserving our integrity at our border? Who gets the vote of the Border Patrol people? That should tell you quite a bit right there. And Kamala Harris, who was the border czar, says, me, I don't have anything to do with it. So I suspect if she won, she would adopt that same philosophy. I don't have anything to do with it. And yet we, the American people, are the ones who suffer. And believe me, I sympathize with people from other countries who want to come here. I really do, because this is the best country in the world. But we have to have a rule of law. We have to have a process whereby we bring people in. And if we don't, you know, all of us have to pay for their medical costs, their housing costs, and a whole host of social issues we have to deal with.
You know, Dr. Ben Carson, former President Obama recently was scolding African-American men and were saying essentially, you know, you should be voting for Kamala Harris. What do you say when you hear that? Because a lot of people felt that backfired, too. And why do you think it is that particularly African-American men, a number of them are saying, no, they're voting for Trump this time?
Well, I got to say, I am absolutely thrilled that so many young African-American men are starting to think for themselves and ask themselves, who actually made a difference in my life? You know, during the Trump administration, we had the lowest black unemployment, the highest take-home wages, record high home ownership. There were so many things. The opportunity zones caused a lot of business people to invest into the economically deprived areas and to maintain their interest in making sure that those areas thrive, because they want to make sure that their investment comes to fruition. So, you know, those are the kind of programs that really work. And, you know, in the early days of our country, there was a common phrase that you saw written by our founders. It was called the common good. And people understood that that meant that not this group or this demographic, but everybody, what works for all of us. And that's what we need to be thinking about now. And when Obama and people like that say, you should be voting for her because you're black, that is just antithetical to the unity that created the strength of this country.
You know, Dr. Ben Carson, there's been so much vitriol, especially coming from the Kamala Harris side of late. I mean, we heard President Biden saying Trump supporters are garbage, which I found just such a distasteful remark. And now Mark Cuban, who is a Kamala Harris surrogate, of course, from Shark Tank. I don't know if you saw this, Dr. Carson. It's amazing where he says, you know, that the women around Trump essentially, you know, are dumb, they're weak. What do you make of this sort of scolding? I mean, it's really gotten just disgraceful. And I think it's such a turnoff. You know, people who, even if they weren't going to vote for, or say they weren't going to vote for President Trump, this may sway them to say, hey, I'm going to vote for this guy. They don't like to be scolded.
Well, I can say I know a lot of those women around President Trump, and they're not dumb by any stretch of the imagination.
I agree.
Some of the smartest people I've met. One of them, I told her I expect her to be the actual first female president. But, you know, I think it's a sense of desperation that leads people to say things like that. I suspect if Mark Cuban had another chance, he would take that back pretty rapidly because I think he's probably getting blistered right now, and he should be. I mean, that's absolutely absurd.
Yeah, I think his wife is probably starting with the blistering. Can you imagine going home? What did you say about women, honey? You know, can you imagine that? Ed Cox.
Dr. Carson, you were actually the secretary of one of our largest government departments. That's Housing and Urban Development. What did you learn from your tenure at that about housing and urban development?
Well, one of the things that was disappointing I learned is that there are a lot of people on Capitol Hill, particularly on the other side of the aisle, who are not that interested in getting people out of poverty and getting people out of dependency. They derive their power from people being dependent. And I found that very, very disturbing. But what was really great is that once we got the fiscal situation under control, you may remember, you always hear these stories about fiscal mismanagement at HUD and how billions of dollars were missing. You probably noticed about a year and a half into the Trump administration that all those stories disappeared. That took a lot of work to make that go away, but it made a big difference because then we were able to get a lot of things done at that point. And working with the people who are the career people.
Governor Patterson? Governor Patterson has a question.
Doctor, I haven't seen you in a long time, but I really appreciated while you were there that you appreciated the whole concept of cluster development. In a lot of our communities, different groups would put up different sites, and if you put up a new building on a block that's in disrepair, if you don't do anything in the next 10 years, the amortized value of the block will be exactly the same. But you seem to understand that if you develop sometimes one side of the neighborhood has to go first before you can, build housing on the other side. And that, when you're able to do that, then the economic development in the community pans out.
Absolutely. And also maintaining the interest in that development was something that was seen with the opportunity zones because people wanted to make sure that their investments came to fruition. Those are the kinds of programs that actually make sense. That was the reason that we had a booming economy before COVID hit. And that's what we can bring back again. But we have to have people who actually understand the economy and are courageous enough to do things sometimes outside of the box.
Well, Dr. Carson, we just have a few seconds left. I'm just seeing now, by the way, a new update that 61 million Americans have now early voted, which is astounding. We just have a few seconds. What's your message to Americans? Because we may not talk to you, I think, before Election Day.
Well, my message is that it's in our own hands. We get a chance to decide what happens with our children and our grandchildren, and they're depending on us to do our duty.
Absolutely. We love having you here. Dr. Carson, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carson.
Thank you, guys. You're great patriots.
Thank you. You
what
are
do we
too,
all
my
stand
friend.
for?
Truth, justice, and the American way.
God bless America.